Hola a todos.
Good morning, everyone.
Además,
Hello,
imagino
everyone.
que
I imagine that in
en
a
pocos
few
lugares juego
places I
tan de
play
local
as
como acá.
local as here.
Bueno, la charla de hoy
Today's
básicamente
talk,
va,
basically, will be
va a
about
versar
what
sobre
monetary policy is
lo que
for
es
the
la política
future.
monetaria de cara al futuro. Y para eso
For
la
that, the
charla tiene
talk
tres
has
partes.
3 parts. One
Tiene una
part
parte
where,
donde
basically, I describe the
básicamente
initial
describo las condiciones
conditions, the
iniciales,
situation in
la
which the
situación
Argentine
en
economy
la que
was
se
at the
encontraba la
time we
economía argentina en
arrived.
el momento que llegamos. Por otra parte, a la luz de lo que estamos
On the
implementando
other
y del
hand,
éxito que
in the
está
light of what
teniendo,
we are implementing and the success we are
lo que voy
having, what
a
I am going
explicar
to
es el
explain
diagnóstico
is
que
the
nosotros
diagnosis, which we develop, and
desarrollamos
as a
y como
consequence the
consecuente
economic policy package,
de
which
ello
we
tenemos
design,
el paquete
and,
de
very
política
particularly, the
económica que
monetary
diseñamos y
issue.
muy particularmente la cuestión monetaria. Yo quiero señalar que
I want to point out
estamos
that we are
frente a un
facing a
evento histórico,
historical
una
event,
forma
an
no
unconventional form,
convencional
to
de
lower
bajar la inflación.
inflation, and that is
Y por
why I
eso creo que
believe
este
that
es un
this is
ambiente
an
que
environment that
amerita en el
merits,
cual
in which we
discutamos
discuss what we are
lo que
doing,
estamos
because although
haciendo,
it is still
porque
premature,
si
when one
bien
has
todavía
historical
es prematuro,
consciousness,
cuando uno tiene
understands the
conciencia histórica,
characteristic of
entiende la
achievement,
característica del logro. Nosotros cuando
when we
llegamos
arrive,
la inflación
wholesale
mayorista, que es la que se
inflation, which
adelanta,
is the
viajaba al
one that
54%
advances,
mensual.
traveled to
Es decir, eso es
54% monthly.
anualizado da
That
17.000.
is, that,
Y el
annualized, gives
último número de
17,000%.
mayorista fue
And in the
2%,
last issue,
con una
wholesaler,
inflación del
was
28%.
2%, that is, an inflation of 28%.
Y creo que vale la pena la discusión y el análisis porque
And I think it is worth
sistemáticamente se dijo que
discussion and
nosotros no tenemos
analysis
programa. Entonces la
because,
pregunta es, ¿cómo hicieron para
systematically,
que
it
baje?
was said that
Es decir,
we
la verdad
have
que
no
que yo
program.
sepa, ni el equipo de Toto ni yo, digamos, hemos estado estudiando con Copperfield cómo hacer magia. Así que
So,
me
the
parece que vale
question
la pena
is, how did they
discutirlo.
do? That is, the
Lo que sucede es
truth
que
that I
después de
know
tantos
neither the
años de
Toto
colectivismo,
team, nor have we
creo
been
que casi
studying
como
with
que
Copperfield how to do magic. So it seems to
vivimos en la
me that it is
población, donde
worth
y hay más que
discussing
nada
it. What happens
en la
is that,
profesión
after so
y
many
los
years of
comunicadores
collectivism, I believe that, in the
perdieron
population, I
la
would
noción y
say, and more
conciencia de
than
qué es
anything in the
un programa de
profession and the
estabilización,
communicators lost
en
notion and
especial
awareness
en
of
una
what a
perspectiva liberal.
stabilization program is,
Un programa de estabilización
especially
tiene
in
un
a liberal
programa
perspective.
fiscal, un programa monetario y una política cambiaria. Ahora, si
A
ustedes después le quieren agregar cosas es
stabilization
porque empiezan a
program
buscar
has a
notas de
tax
dirigir,
program, a
no con
monetary
notas de
program, and an exchange
política. O
policy.
sea, es una forma distinta de ver el proceso. Y además me parece que también vale la
Now
pena
if you,
analizarlo porque a
then,
diferencia
you want to add things is
de otros
because you
casos
begin to show leading quotas,
interesantes
political
de esta
quotas. That is a
estabilización,
different way to
es
see the
que
process
no hubo
and,
una
in
hiperinflación
addition,
previa,
it seems to me that it
porque
is also worth
cuando ustedes tienen una
analyzing
hiperinflación
because,
previa, lo que
unlike
hacen
other
es
interesting
licuar los
cases of
activos
this
financieros, por lo tanto,
stabilization, there
la
was no
estabilización después
previous
es muy fácil porque parten de
hyperinflation
niveles de
because
demanda de
when you
dinero
have
muy
previous
bajos, entonces
hyperinflation,
la
what it
propia
does is
recomposición de
liquefy
la demanda de dinero
financial
hace que sea
assets.
mucho más fácil estabilizar. Ahora, claro, pasar por esa experiencia y llegar a ver la cantidad de pobres en el
Therefore,
95% no sería un
stabilization,
ejercicio
then,
agradable,
is
por decirlo
very
de alguna
easy
manera.
because they start from
La
very
otra
low demand
característica muy
levels.
importante,
Then
y
the
que de hecho durante la campaña
recomposition
yo
of
me
the
quería
demand
mucho
for
contra
money
esta
makes it
acusación,
much easier to
es que nosotros no
stabilize.
hicimos un plan Bonex, es decir, no hubo expropiación. De
Now,
hecho,
of course, go
si
through
bien
that
nadie hablaba de cómo
experience and get
resolver
to see
el
the
problema
amount of
de los
poor
pasivos
in
recuperados, nosotros éramos
95% would
los
not
únicos
be a
que
pleasant
hablábamos de los
exercise,
pasivos
to put it in
remunerados.
some way. The other very important feature
Básicamente,
in that, in fact, during
lo
the
que nosotros
campaign,
no
I
dábamos
had to
eran
deal a
fechas
lot against this
de vuelta, porque
accusation is
nosotros somos
that
un
we did
gobierno
not
liberal y
do a
libertario.
Bonex plan. That is, there was no expropriation. In fact, although no one talked about how to solve the problem of paid liabilities, and we were the only ones who talked about the paid liabilities, basically, what we did not give were dates, and back, because we are a libertarian liberal government and, consequently, process had to be market, and that depends on the decisions of individuals. Now, something that seemed impossible, we solved it in 6 months, that is, we ended with the fourth fiscal deficit of 10 points of the GDP, and that seems that nobody notices it, but it goes that, in terms of expected inflation and forward, this is a truly significant issue. Another additional feature of this program is that it has no price controls. In addition, we have not set the exchange rate. That is, there is no fixed exchange rate, there is a crawling peg system. And that is also interesting, for the purpose of looking at inflationary results. That is, having a crawling peg system. The program, today, as designed, has an induced inflation, which is the crawling peg, plus international inflation, that, more or less, yields a monthly inflation rate of 2.5%.
Y que nació acá, que fue el plan de convertibilidad del ministro Domingo Felipe Cavallo.
So when one looks at the retail inflation, that, the last record, was 3.5%, means that true macro inflation has been traveling to 1. That is, it is the difference between the observed inflation and the crawling peg, plus international inflation. That means that then inflation of the program is in the order of 1%. This means that, today, true inflation in Argentina was traveling to 13% per year, and that seems like a dream. Throughout what we have been suffering during the last 20 years, or since the creation of the damn Central Bank of the Argentine Republic in 1935, except for the period that was the most successful stabilization program of Argentine history, and that was born here, which was the convertibility plan of Minister Domingo Felipe Cavallo. On the other hand, this, in addition, became rebuking relative prices, and, with all this, we are carrying inflation at levels that could then be oscillating between 10 and 25%, which, if they do not want to consider it a miracle or does not like economic theory, which we are using, we can adduce it to the forces of heaven. And finally, what I am going to do is tell what the monetary policy is forward, because that, also, will help us communicate and try to explain what we are thinking. Facing the future, I will explain the concept of endogenous dollarization and, then, show how we are seeing growth and how this links with the monetary part. That is, today, I will not be discussing different monetary regimes and so on, because, it seems to me, that it is already an argument that seems little relevant, and it is time for us to focus on the future. In that sense, when we assumed it was a situation of a huge collapse, we were facing what could have been the most important crisis in Argentine history, since it combined the elements of the three great Argentine crises. We had an overhang money, which was twice as much in the previous one in Rodrigazo, there in 1975, during the government of Maria Estela Martínez de Perón, a frightening government that implied not only the AAA and the decree of annihilation and, and some additional aberrations, but in the middle, sextupled the inflation rate and multiplied by 5 the amount of poor. So, if we were twice as a monetary imbalance, the inflation rate would have multiplied by 12, that is, we would have taken it to levels of 2,400. And, on the other hand, we could not have multiplied by 5 by the amount of poor because 100% cannot pass. That is, only with one of the parts of the imbalance. The other imbalance was the imbalance in the balance of the central bank, since we had a relationship of paid liabilities with respect to the base. 4 times. They left us a situation where, in one day, we could quintuplicate the amount of money, and that situation was much worse than the one we had in the central bank in 1989, before the hyperinflation exploded of Alphonsin, which, later, ended with the flight of Alphonsin of power 6 months before. And, in addition, we also had social indicators that were worse than those that were. In December 2001, after falling from convertibility and coup d'etat, driven by Duhad and Alphonsin, which, paradoxically, Alphonsin shows him as the father of democracy, being that he was in favor of a coup d'etat, but that, obviously, pacify the debt to Clarin, he made him show him as a hero. In that sense, we found that, during the first week of December, inflation had been traveling to 1% daily, something that implies annual inflation of 3,700%. When one looks, the second week, and computes the relevant 15 days, that is, inflation had accelerated at a rate of 7,500% annual. If they take that of the CPI, 25.5%, we would be talking about an inflation, annualized, close to 1,500%, and if we take the IPM, the wholesaler, annualized, that 54 implied 17,000%. That was the context in which we were. And, in addition, the imbalances, which I mentioned, also had the imbalances flows. We had twin deficits for the equivalent of 17 points of GDP. Think that when, in what is the literature of early indicators of crisis, a deficit of 4% twins is a yellow alert, 8 is red alert, well, 17, it was purple, violet, and that's why we won. What did they expect? While we usually describe the inheritance, we do not complain about the inheritance. We came and solved the problem because in reality, I am the first liberal libertarian president of the history of humanity, and that does not happen in normal conditions of pressure and temperature. Now, of those 15 points, 17 deficit points, 15 were in the national state, 5 it was the treasure deficit, and 10 era of the central bank. At the same time, we had a 200% gap, that is, the relationship between the parallel exchange rate and the officer was 3-to-1. To me that causes me grace, because, when the exchange rate hits the exchange rate and the inflation rate is accelerated, some economists blame me for having devalued, and it seems to me that if that does someone, that it is not formed in economics, I can understand it. That is, people are not obliged to know about economics. But I find it strange to say professional economists, because if I have a 200% gap and I have negative net international reserves at $12,000 million, I did not devalue. The only thing I did is sincere. It is bleaching things. It is to show things how they really are. Moreover, not only that we had that problem, but, in addition, we had between the debt of the Sira, that the truth is a real scandal, and trapped dividends. That debt, in the central one, was for $60 billion. We also had debt, in pesos, beating the equivalent of $90 billion. We had external debt overcoming for $25 billion, where, mostly, it was with multilateral organizations, but since the previous government lived breaching, the program was fallen. That was also very interesting because everyone talked about the program was not consistent, and thinking that one, after such a non-compliance history, goes and sits in the background. That discussion is not a quick discussion, and, in general, that discussion demands 3 months. We close the program in a weekend. It means that we had enough orderly. So, in that sense, the situation was quite complex, and we also had a hidden liability inside the central that was the theme of the puts, and that was the whole picture we had met. So what we needed was to stop the possibility of a hyper, because if we had gone to hyperinflation, the situation would have been truly disastrous. If you look at the jumps in poverty of what is the crisis of Rodrigazo, the hyperinflation of Alfonsín, or the coup d'état de la Rua, will realize that any of those situations by itself would have doubled the number of poor. So, the situation was quite complicated. Moreover, I am also surprised by the intellectual dishonesty of economists and politicians, or worse, of politicians who are economists. So, for example, one of them said, no, you have the responsibility of having increased the number of poor by 5 million. This is also very interesting and raises how difficult the design of economic policy can be, but, above all, the communication of it. As you all know, in Argentina, poverty, within the methodologies that there is, Argentina uses the income method. Then, you look at the basic food basket. From there the total basic basket is removed. That has a consequence. In terms of income, the conversion between these two lines are called angle curves or angle coefficients, and compares it to income and looks how many poor are there. Basically, I am explaining very synthetically what the methodology is like. So, the question is, how if I do a sincereness, then the numbers fly, and then what does it mean to sincere? And this is also worth discussing it and analyzing it. Argentina, in fact, came with price controls. That is, the previous government controlled prices, stepped on rates. The truth is that if you look at any report you will see everything that was the imbalance in relative prices. Then, when you have a price control, that is, you still have a fiscal deficit, they finance it with monetary issuance. That said, the previous government issued 13 points of the GDP during the last year, where the inflation generated by the broadcast in Argentina has a lag between 18 and 24 months. That is, the aberrations of the previous government will still have to purge. And it is not that I say it now, I said it in campaign, and you can look for it in my videos. Almost 10 years and I say exactly the same. So what happens? You have the price control and two effects appear. One is that they go to other goods and begin to scarce the goods, which are in the control, which, in general, are the ones in the price index. So when you look at the price index does not reflect the effects of control, the effects of scarcity, to the point that you can grab and get a time, which was what happened on the end of the previous government, that the gondolas were empty. So, of that he reminds me a lot of an example that Juan Carlos de Pablo gives in one of his brilliant books about economic policy, where he says, a man enters a bazaar and says, I want that vase. How much does it cost? 5 million. How 5 million, if in front is 1 million? Well, go and buy in front. No, well, there is no. Well, here when there is no more it will cost 1 million. That is, the price is the one. Then, it means that that shortage problem is not contemplated in the index. Therefore, the measurement of what that basket costs is a liar. Because, in addition, what is the purchasing power of 100 pesos, 1,000 pesos, 10,000 pesos, 20,000, whatever you want, if the gondola is empty? How much is that price? That price is infinite because it doesn't matter how many pesos are going to throw it because the product does not exist. Then, in the face of that situation, where the product does not exist and you do not sincere, the products do not appear. So, if you do not sincere, what happens? It is going to starve because the products do not appear. The only way in which the products reappear is that you sincere prices. At the moment that the prices that you sincere, of course that is statistically registered, jumps the basic food basket by angle curve, salta the total basic basket and you register poorer. There is a wonderful job, which has recently done a professor at Tela, who is González Rosada, and shows that this sincere led 57% poverty. But that was there. But it was easier to hide it then. No, it was not easier to hide it. That is, you do not eat statistics, you eat really product. What we have to try is for statistics to say and be the most similar to the truth. And the good news is that, today, after for 5 months, the real wages go up without stopping, where the ones that go up are those of the private sector, where the informal private is being very strongly recovered, and the one that comes not recovering and is lagging behind is the public sector, because there are chainsaw. The data for the last quarter, according to the estimates of González Rosada, is 49%. That is, we have just lowered poverty by 8 percentage points. Yes, that we are taking care of the most vulnerable. Then, the point is okay, we are lowering inflation. There is no more powerful social plan than lower inflation because it is clear that the inflation tax is a super regressive tax. So how did they do it? It seems to me that is why the diagnosis is important. Now, I remember that prior to the campaign, now it is no longer discussed, but prior to the campaign, the issue of the nature of inflation was more discussed. So, there is a set of economists who believe it is multi-causal. Well, since I matured and grew up, I never believed that thing. I believed it when I was very small, but one later realizes that the magi are the parents. What do I know? So I always adhered to the monetary hypothesis of inflation. That is so important. Even in the definition used by an inflation economist will make a difference. For example, in my case, inflation is the loss of purchasing power of money. That is, it is generated by an excess of supply and money, either because the supply rises, because the demand falls, or because both things occur at the same time, and all the prices expressed in monetary units go up. That is to say, if I have that definition, I have to go and shit with Trumpard with Reconquest 266. That is, I have to go and grab it with the central bank. Now, the other definition of inflation, which is what politicians like, is the general rise in prices. So, there you grab it with the trade unionists, that they are not any holy, obviously, with the entrepreneurs, with the workers, that is, with anyone less with the politicians. Obviously politicians love that. So, it seems that this debate is quite aimed. I am not listening much to the heterodox and those nonsense of multicausal inflation. Now, the way in which we reach this is not the same. It depends on which school they are standing. The monetarist hypothesis is not the same. To Friedman, the hypothesis to Robert Lucas Jr. is not the same, and the hypothesis in the Austrian format is not the same. So, there it is known that I adhere to the hypothesis of the Austrian school, so something that seems quite obvious is not so obvious. That is, for example, in the monetarist hypothesis, money is not short neutral, but it is long. In the rational expectations hypothesis, it is still short term, unless there is surprise. But the effects of surprise over time, if you abuse that mechanism, disappears. In the Austrian hypothesis, money is never neutral. Moreover, it is a pernicious element, which hurts, and that, the truth is that they will leave, I will not plunder the end, but they imagine it. That is why it is so important to return to the base. It seems something that is rudimentary. It seems a comment for beginner. But it happens that it seems that economists have forgotten such basic things that, then, we are delirious in anything and we forget what the problem is about. The first point is, why does money exist? That is, why there is money, because if we do not know why money exists, how we will understand the monetary hypothesis of inflation? If we do not understand what we are talking about, then the money exists, basically, because if you did not have money you would have a barter economy. Now in a barter economy, the operation of a barter economy is quite complex, because you have two big problems. The first is the double coincidence. That is, you have to find someone who wants to buy what you want to sell. But, in addition, they need reciprocal, which is a fairly complex problem. Now, for example, I can find the baker who wants bread and I want bread. Now there is an indivisibility problem too, because I can want a kilo of bread, I don't know, 2, 3, and I want to distribute. But I am not willing to give a complete talk for 3 kilograms of bread. And the baker is not interested in listening to me, 3 minutes of my presentation. So that indivisibility, plus the problem of double coincidence, means that many transactions are lost, and that generates a loss of enormous well-being. Then money comes to solve this problem. And this is how other types of money appeared. That is, the man did not cry, "Oh, what problem, what I do not consume." No, no, he looked for the return. What he did is find him back. And that return was that there were some goods that were exchanged, more than others. Then, you went and bought that good not because they were interested in consuming that good, but they went and bought that good to buy the other good, that is, it was a good of indirect exchange. This is an extremely important issue. This is fundamental because, if we do not understand this, we do not understand the nature of money. Money is a good of indirect exchange. This is the key because, now, I will explain why it is so important to understand this. Now if it is a good of indirect exchange, that also implies understanding the different currencies that the human being had. For example, when the man was a nomad, the first currency he had was the cattle. And why was cattle? And because they were walking with the walked. They walked with the more feet to the side, something that today would be quite psychologically solving, that they walk with the bug that, then they will kill to eat it. Back. They are things that let's not naturalize them, but it was how the world worked. And, of course, but then the man became sedentary, and what did he eat? I ate bread, so what ate if it was bread? What I used the most was wheat. Then one of the first coins that appeared was wheat because just, not because he wanted to eat wheat or that he wanted bread, but served him as an indirect exchange. And so another type of currency has appeared, such as salt, linen, tobacco has appeared. Moreover, notice, I am a big man and, at some point, there were prison films. And what did they use as money in prisons? The cigarette. Then there are very funny things, such as hyperinflation of Germany, cognac was used. Then Milton Friedman, at one time, makes a joke that says, yes, they used the cognac, the most liquid definition of money I met in my life. And what is all this comes, that if we understand that money is an indirect exchange good that we only use to make transactions, that implies that then the demand for money is a derived demand. It is a mirror demand, whose counterpart is the set of excess demand functions of the entire economy, that is, everything that is the goods market. That is, with which, if the classics begin to go back and they can read that in Hume, they can read it in Adam Smith, who probably describes it as John Stuart Mill. They talked about a real side and a monetary side. They talked about the monetary veil and said good, while we do not nonsense everything works barbarian. The problem is when we start to put our hand, and that is where the system breaks down. And why is this important? Because if the demand for money, the good of indirect exchange, that is, a demand for mirror, a derived demand, the fundamentals of the demand for money, the real component within the demand for money, is neither the buried of that of putting the income, nor the mounted that of putting the interest rate. And that is also important that it is clear, when you build a general balance system, in the excess demand function the income does not appear, because the income is derived from the sale of leisure, plus the participation that you have of the benefits in the companies, which depend on the prices. That is why there are only prices and admission does not appear anywhere, and the functions of excess demand are homogeneous, zero grade, in prices and only relative prices and nothing more appear. And if you use a numerary, you will be scaled in that numerary. In a monetary economy, that numerary is money. But not only that, nor does the interest rate appear. The interest rate does not exist because there is money. The interest rate exists because there is time. That is, if there was no time there would be no interest rate, it would not make any sense. It is a theoretical contradiction. Then what you will find, in the functions of excess demand, is price vectors. And present prices and future prices will enter, and the relationship between present prices and future prices what will determine is the interest rate. And when everyone is managed, the emerging interest rate is the same for each relationship between periods. In short, the demand for money is a function, which depends on the consumption vector. The consumer vector is all consumption, of all products not only today, but from here to eternity. And if it depends on consumption, will consumption depend on what? That consumption path, that is, that path for the consumption vector. He will depend on what Robert Lucas Jr. said were the deep parameters. The deep parameters that are? the preferences, that is, the utility functions, including the intertemporal preference rate, because we are now talking about an economy, which is not a period, but is of the amount of time you want. Not only that, but also, it will depend on technology. That is, of the production function. It will depend on the factors of factors and will depend on the property system. That is, all deep parameters. That is, if I put it in a photo today, that's all data. Therefore, the demand for money, in normal conditions of pressure and temperature, would they have to be what? Directly a granite function. That is why the classics were not so dumb when they put the quantitative theory of Cambridge version, if you want, as a fraction of income. That is, they were not dumb. Then there is the problem of the inconsistency of degree, that it is a homogeneous function, grade 1, and that cannot pace the system, but it is a problem of a mathematical nature. That Mises solved it, among other problems that solved Mises. But beyond that, if now the money demand function is a granite function, that actual demand function means that, in balance in the money market, real balances must be matched. That is, the amount of money divided the price level. Therefore, the price level will come determined why. For the amount of money, that is, when you set the amount of money, given the demand for money, the price level is determined. In the background, it is neither more nor less than, otherwise, the problem of the nominal anchor. That is, when the central bank determines the amount of money, it determines the nominal scale of the economy. Hence, when the central bank increases the amount of money, prices rise. Then the monetary nature of inflation says that inflation is, always and everywhere, a monetary phenomenon generated by an excessive supply of money or a fall in the demand for money. That makes the purchasing power of money fall and, therefore, all prices expressed a monetary unit rise. And that process is not neutral, because the way in which you derive utility, that is, if you have individuals who are different, that will basically generate that money is not neutral, because the marginal utility of 20,000 pesos for me is not the same as you have for each one. Therefore, that will modify my consumption pattern. Therefore, it is not neutral. Or I have a single individual, but now I have several goods. The different goods will not derive the same utility. Then, therefore, if I have an economy where individuals are not all the same and, in addition, there is no single good, money is not neutral. If you want to go to the world of Friedman or Robert Lucas Jr., where it is neutral, you have to go to what? To a situation where you have a representative agent and a unique good. And there they derive the result of the neutrality of money. But in real life those assumptions are not fulfilled. Therefore, money is not neutral. And I tell you more, the money you can do is cause damage. Because if the central bank emits, it generates damage. Because if the central bank contracts, it generates damage. If you do nothing, what I am paying for, what I have for it, what am I paying for? And, if I think, let's say fatally arrogant, that I have such bright guys that can do what people would determine, why I will give it to if people can do alone. My allegation has already begun, against the central bank. But here the important thing is the monetary nature of inflation. And, obviously, when the central bank begins to make gears with the amount of money, the nominal scale begins to move and, obviously, that relative prices begin to distort and inflation begins to generate huge damage. That is, one of the benefits of having stable inflation, which does not spill, that the only stable inflation number that does not spill is zero. Then, basically, if I generate inflation to generate relative price distortions, I begin to affect the consumer, saving, investment paths, affect the capital structure and end generating cycles of boom and busts in general, above, linked to economic policy, and economic policy usually makes those barabasses in electoral times. So can you believe that there is a guy who is so crazy that he wants to go to zero deficit, that it is to take out the fiscal policy in an electoral year and zero broadcast, which is to take out the monetary policy in an electoral year. I mean, look, if this ends well, not only that it will be a political success that is going around the planet, but it will also be a revolution for the economists themselves, that is, the policymaker, which relegates to make monetary and fiscal policy expansive in the electoral year. This was not in any textbook. Therefore, having tried my hypothesis that money, the issuance of money is the cause of inflation, then, now, what we have to do is why we issued money, that is, how did the previous government issue 13 points of GDP? So, basically what we had to do was cut the elements, which made the amount of money grow. Then, the first, more obvious and more evident to everyone was the fiscal deficit. Now, I mean this, the fiscal deficit was a third of the total deficit, which we had. In the treasure, in nation I mean. It was 5, the treasury, and 10 the quasi-F. That is, that he was dismissed that we had, in the central bank, it was twice as much as we had, in the treasure. And of those 10 nobody spoke on top. This was the most serious thing of all this. So, for that we had to cut with the fiscal deficit. We during the campaign, and that cannot say that I did not announce it, we campaigned with a chainsaw. Look, the campaign, symbolically, I had 3 things. One was the chainsaw, which was the tax adjustment. Another was a dollar ticket, which was basically the currency competition and the elimination of the central bank that gave it dollarization. And know what it is to have to try to explain. It is not competition, it is a huge procedure. And then, in addition, in our actions, they appeared, recurrently, flags of Israel, that is. Notice that in the fiscal we are fulfilling. In international politics it is being fulfilled. And I will show you how we are fulfilling in the monetary as well. No one was deceived in the electoral campaign. It is the first time in the history of mankind that a candidate campaigns saying that he will cut public spending. And, in fact, we did it. When we said that we were going to zero deficit, they said we were crazy, that it was impossible, that a luck could cut 1 point of the GDP per year. And we proposed that, the first year, we were going to zero deficit. And the most incredible is that we succeed, in the first month of management. If you look at the numbers, from Argentina, in the last 123 years Argentina had deficit for 113 years, and in the only 10 years, which had no deficit they were default, therefore, it was a lie. That is, it is the first time, in 124 years, that Argentina will end with fiscal balance in the financial line, go that the forces of the sky push. That was a very important element because the issuance of money cut off for what is called the fiscal route, that is, one of the monetary emission sources was cut, and then it began to discuss whether the quality of the adjustment. Look, Argentina, the tax adjustment, in real terms, is 36.6%. That never happened in the history of humanity, except in cases that there has been war. And yet it is among the biggest adjustments in history. But that was not just the adjustment that was made, it also went for the adjustment in the central bank. And this is important because nobody said how I was going to fix it. There are others who irresponsibly said it was fixed alone, which was the same that said nothing, but that when they asked him how, they did not know what to do. They said that he was going to fix alone. There was another one who said that what had to be done was to raise the interest rate, which all he did was enlarge the problem. But we knew that the interest rate had to be touched because our conception of monetary nature and inflation, explained by the amount of money, definitely shows that touching prices is wrong. To give an idea of madness that is to make monetary policy playing the interest rate, let's see, how can we do it? Suppose, do you remember that we had, at a time, a Secretary of Commerce named Guillermo Moreno? That is, the question is that of controlling the prices that Moreno made, and I ask them to be emphatic. Can they shout me if it is right or is wrong? I don't see them very convinced. Are they with throat or brunette problems? It was nice. They can be more specific, that you find out that nobody likes price controls. Well, wanting to control the interest rate is wanting to control present and future prices. It is like a kind of Moreno Reloaded, and is the incredible version of Moreno. In fact, if we had paid attention to those who said that we had to go to positive real interest rates, today, the relationship of paid liabilities with respect to the base would be above 10 times. We would have spent talking about carry trade. We would have spent talking about the LeLeaks ball or whatever you want. We would have talked about all that kind of thing, and if we did not expropriate everything, then we exploded. That would be the discussion. Today, in Argentina, if we had paid attention to what they said, we had to go to real interest rates. As we do not believe that the interest rate is a mechanism of intertemporal coordination and inflation a monetary problem, nor did it occur to us to do that geese, and less bad that we did not do it, with which imagine all the books that we are throwing in the trash of the types that speak that, no, that the rate, loot all that because it is useless. That said, then, the point was, we make a devaluation and what we arbitrate were the rates in dollars, that is, the replacement of coins. That implied that real interest rates, in pesos, were negative, but were still very high in dollars. So how were the rates, dollars to lower, and how was the balance of the central bank to clean? Well, a part of the balance of the central bank was liquefied, that is, part of the adjustment paid the banks, that is, they had to stop working as a bicycle and had to start working on banks. But not only that, but as time progressed and fiscal numbers were solid, we were able it was financed with monetary issuance and that this monetary issuance, so that it did not impact prices, took it out of the market and paid interest rate. That should always have been debt of the treasure. Then, among the masterful, monstrous task, Cyclopeia of Toto Caputo, which was not chosen for the best minister of economy in the world, which I congratulate him publicly, added to the enormous work of Pablo Cuerno repersonating the debt market in pesos, and the fabulous task of Santiago Basili in the central bank, we began to disarm the problem of the remunerated liabilities. We would have quintupled the amount of money in one day if instead of being liberal libertarios we would have acted as liberated liberals. Then, in that context, something incredible happened, something that nobody found the solution, which everyone looked for the side. In 6 months, we cleaned the balance of the central bank of the paid liabilities, making an adjustment equivalent to 10 points of the GDP. And that makes, together with the adjustment we made in the treasure, we have made the greatest adjustment in the history of mankind, and here we are. Therefore, we ended with the problem of paid liabilities. Then we solved the question of the puts, and the only thing that remained was the issuance by external sector. And, obviously, look, I will tell you an anecdote that is fabulous. Boca plays an intercontinental final. If I am not mistaken, it went against Milan. Boca defines on penalties. This is from my time that was from Boca. Notice that I stopped being from Boca when a certain character returned and when a 5 appeared, which had less mark than the salty. That made me stop being mouth. But it doesn't matter, that is a detail of 25th order. If it continues, at some point, I will be able to return to the court, but that is another issue. That said, they go to a definition by penalties, and Battaglia era the penalty, and, fortunately, thanks to Abbondanzieri, which is also a tifoso, just like Palermo, they imagine that I am Iri Paler. Then, Boca wins that final, and a journalist has no better idea than going to report it when he wants to go to celebrate Battaglia. And then he goes, and instead of asking him, I don't know, what he felt about, they had won everything, what does it feel like wrong? Then Battaglia, with great wisdom, fabulous, says, did you ever kick a penalty in an intercontinental final? No. Well, look, the penalties air what they kick, what they don't kick does not air, he said. Sometimes some say we make mistakes. And yes, of course, we make mistakes. He who makes mistakes, and especially people who do a long time. If I had told him that, with 15% of the Chamber of Deputies and with 10% of the Chamber of Senators we were going to make a structural reform, which is the greatest history in Argentina, because it is 8 times larger than the Menem, they would have told me that it is impossible, and, however, we did it. Or when they said that, for example, it was impossible to end the pickets, and thanks to the management of that huge minister, which is Dr. Bullrich, today in Argentina there are no pickets. Or those who said it was impossible to end the intermediaries of poverty until I put a minister who has the balls, like the Mario Alberto Kempes, and ended with the managers of poverty. So imagine all the things we do every day. Look at all the things that it dysregulates. Every day, Minister Sturzenegger. That is, with which something that was impossible, we make it possible every day. Obviously, if you are doing things all the time, and some will throw it into the gallery, yes, life, but it seems to me that in the net, without a doubt, we are doing the best government in history. In this sense, when we move forward to the program, to the monetary part of the excess zero offer, basically what we were saying was only we will issue to buy dollars. Believing that the demand for money when it grows is with a fixed exchange rate, it brings us to leave sales of dollars and the increase in reserves. And the problem is that, of course, this was not in the textbooks, because one day I was self-flagellating and, a friend, he said, Che, but was that in textbooks? No. And then what do you want? Well, that's fine, but I shouldn't have. Well, it doesn't matter. We are there, and we didn't realize that, when you have an open economy model, without capital control, what is the sale of dollars to the central bank is a demand for money. But that is true when there is no capital control. That is, now when I have capital controls and I am forcing the currency, that sale of dollars, that purchase of pesos is not a demand for money. One part may be demand for money, but the other party is not a demand for money. And that was what was going to the exchange rate, and that was what I was doing, that there was pressure on prices or that inflation would not lower everything as fast as we wanted. So when we are facing a run and the dollar was in 1500 and that everyone was predicting that 2000 jumped and that at the other week 2,500, and so on. We decided to change the monetary program again and went to what is zero emission. Today is below 1200. Something happened that had never happened in Argentina, and the dollar lowered. And this is how we reach zero emission. And then today we discuss what is the departure of the stocks, that is, today we are from the length of the stocks much closer than what we were in December. Because, in addition, in the middle we recognized a loss of capital in the central bank, the result of the previous management, for the equivalent of $45 billion. And, in addition, in the middle, we bought about $20 billion. That is, if you want to go to a system, whether currency competition or a free system, or if you want to finish closing the central bank, the first thing you have to do is clean it and restore heritage. Because, in that way, when you restore heritage, it means that monetary liabilities will be rescued and, therefore, the price level is anchored. Instead, if you want to do it, the other day I listened to a stupid, because he is directly a stupid, who said that we could do the first day closing the central bank. Well, look, if you do not rescue the weights and do it with negative net assets, how do you eliminate the weights? The only way to eliminate them is with hyperinflation and generating 95% of the poor, and yes, in January, on January 1st, they would already have it back to the Kirchnerists in power, a genius. Either to stabilize, dollarize or eliminate the central bank, the first thing to do is to clean up the central bank. And we have done that, we have done it as never before in history, because we not only clean the loss of capital of $45 billion, but at the same time we buy $20 billion. Wow, we improve the balance sheet, the central bank. That is why prices lower. As for what is the exit of the stocks, basically, three conditions have to be given. The first is that the money overhang disappears. The money overhang takes place when I have price controls or when I have capital controls. Basically, we generated fiscal deficit, we issued money, that money went to the currency market, pressed the exchange rate, while the purchasing power of the weight fell. Then trying to anchor prices with the exchange rate was set and reserves began to be lost. When reservations were lost, excess demand for garrotazo was eliminated, which is capital control. In that way, you are forced to demand more weights than those who want. Increase the tax base of the inflation tax, and that is the way they corrected. But there you have a lot of pesos left over because they are pesos that wanted to buy dollars, and could not and were trapped. So, the first thing you have to do is eliminate money overhang. So, the question is, how do you know what the demand for money is to determine how much the money overhang is just? And that, although one can do it, has its issues, that is, to believe that function of demand for money. So, there is another mechanism. We decided to keep the amount of money constant. If I keep the amount of money constant, I know that money overhang disappears when there is no more inflation. So, I set the amount of money. When there is no more inflation, there is no more money overhang. If the inflation of the program today is 2.5, the induced, and looks at the one observed in 3.5, today the program generates an inflation point, that is, money overhang still is still cleaning. So, the first thing we have to find is that the inflation observed mapping with induced inflation, because the day that happens means that the money overhang was cleaned, that is, they stopped overflowing pesos. That is a very important element. The day that disappears the money overhang, that occurs when the observed inflation coincides with the induced one. And it is not something of a single month. It has to be something that is verified in a robust way. First condition, let money overhang disappear. Do you reach? No, because I still have stock problems. So, I also have to solve the problem, for example, of the dividends abroad that I still did not pay and I have them trapped. That is, I also need to fix the problem of foreign currency stocks. Naturally, do you reach that? No, one more condition is missing, and it is that the monetary base in its traditional definition coincides with the broad monetary base. What is the difference? The difference is the LFEs and the LCAPs. So, to the extent that the economy begins to recover, there is a demand for money. If that is so, what we have to see is that the LFEs have to shrink, and it is something that is happening. Because you are a company, you have money at money market, there is a recovery of economic activity, and there is, either because they are uploading real wages, which 5 months ago go up, because they are improving in real terms the retirement, because the stock cycle was exhausted and you have to repurchase them, then the economic activity begins to move. In fact, the recession ended between April and May, and we are in recovery. Do you know that, today, the endless EMAE, August, is at the same level as December? That is, we put the greatest adjustment in the history of humanity and we already recover the level of economic activity with which we arrive, go if that does not resemble a miracle. So, what company is going to do to produce? Are you going to borrow? No, you will disarm your money market. When he disassembles his money market and asks the bank for the bank he does disable the position of the LFEs. Then, the treasurer pays the LFEs, pay the LECAPS. And what does the monetary base, in the traditional definition, begin to appear and begin to serve the broad monetary base, all driven by the demand for money, not on the side of the offer. So that does not generate pressure in the price index because it is demand. Say, it occurs from the demand for money. When the gap between the traditional and wide monetary base coincides, at the same time that the problem of debt stock in foreign currency and the inflation of the program is zero, that is, equal to the induced program. At that time, there are no stock problems, there are no flow problems, and there are no excess pesos. Therefore, that is the day we are going to open the stocks. And that day we are going to open it without any shock, because there is no what to go against the weight. That is, the solution to get out of the stocks is also intended, but it depends on the decisions of individuals. As these elements converge faster, closer is the exit of the stocks. Obviously, if they put a silver cake and fix the problem of stocks, I open and leave the stocks, do not have any doubt. Now, the point is how we think from here forward, without the stock. How will monetary policy work? Look, here the issue is that we have decided zero emission. So what happens if I have zero broadcast and the economy begins to recover and, obviously, as a consequence, the demand for money goes up? So, if the demand for money goes up and the amount of money is given, what will happen to me? Several things are going to happen to me, but the most obvious thing is that I will have deflation. Moreover, another thing that will happen to me is that I am going to bring the dollars to monetize, and when I bring the dollars, what happens to me? I take them to the gear market to get pesos. So, that generates an abrupt drop in the nominal exchange rate, and the problem that can generate that is that the adjustment speed is so fast in the financial market with respect to the goods market, which can generate bankruptcies. So, or I have the deflation or I have the bankruptcies. So how do we solve that? We have already given the solution. Some are implementing it, which is the currency competition. That is, you, the individuals themselves, are the ones who monetize the economy. Then, take your dollars, and today you can make transactions in dollars or in any currency. That is, today there is currency competition. In fact, you can use the currency you want. Why do we do this? So that, in that way, they do not have to go to weight, and then there is a very abrupt appreciation of the weight, generated by a problem on the real side. And that is happening today. A supermarket has done, and from what he did, I say now, since they did. Thank you, Diarco, because you showed the others that can be done. Do it all. Then you now begin to circulate the dollars in the economy to make transactions. Then, if you before had a fixed exchange rate model, what happens? No, well, you needed to go, sell the dollars. The central bank bought them and stretched the amount of money. Notice that what stretches the amount of money is the demand for money. But if I do not increase the offer, then how do I solve that? Or with deflation, or what people do, a currency competence system. Enter the dollars and use them as they have felt. If you start thinking that the structural reforms we made are a 90-position economic leap and that today we have institutions, from the formal, which resemble those of Germany, France, Italy, Argentina has to grow a lot in the coming years. There is a job of Juan Pablo Nicolini, who says that, with reaching fiscal balance, in 10 years, we double the GDP per capita, we will grow to 7% per year. Not only that, but also if you look, the fact of having made a fiscal adjustment of 15 points of the GDP meant returning to the private sector 15 savings points, and that will finance the investment. That will make the economy grow. In addition, they have the advantages of the RIGI. They have the fall of the country risk. Or someone would have imagined that, receiving the country with 3,000 country risk. Today we have broken the barrier of the 900 points, and that, when we will release the stocks, we will start the way so that, sooner or later, we become investment grace. What was impossible, we are making it possible. And notice that, according to the economy, it is growing, because the discount rates also fall. Inflation disappears, we deregulate, and they are all elements that make the economy grow more. I suggest seeing my talk in idea that I present the case of Argentina as a business case. Then, in that context, with more demand for money, given the competition of currencies, the economy will begin to monetize people by putting their own dollars inside the economy. And that is going to do that. If I have given the amount of pesos, am I going to have what? More dollars relatively, and there will be a time when the relationship between dollars and pesos in the economy will be so great that the dollarization will be de facto, and to do it in the facts, having sanitized the balance of the central bank will be easier than a click of fingers. Therefore, in the end, we will be able to dollarize and eliminate the central bank and end that unclean cancer that has been in Argentine history called the Central Bank of the Argentine Republic, which caused us to take 13 zeros to the currencies, that we destroy 5 monetary signs, that we had 2 hyperinflations without war, and that would have been a mechanism that fed the scam of politicians. Therefore, the scam of politicians in the electoral, which is incidentally we are the only party that took the electoral reform and put the unique ballot. We are the only government that ensures fiscal balance, because today we go to the budget with a zero deficit law, and if you want to spend something else, spend, but they will have to cut it from elsewhere, and they will have to put the trout and tell people where they get it. Finally, with everything we are doing in the central bank and in monetary matters, at some point the relationship between dollars inside the economy and weight will be so great that we will be able to dollarize. We will be able to close the central bank, and we will have ended with that cancer that we inherit from 1935, when that unclean institution was created that was the central bank of the Argentine Republic, that for the only thing that served was to enrich politicians and impoverish Argentines. Argentina of the caste was over. The Argentina of free men who are going to be prosperous arrives. Thank you very much. Forces of the heaven accompanies them. And long live freedom, damn it. Long live freedom, damn it. Long live freedom, damn it. Thank you so much.